smoke alarms, the detectors, and water heater bracing done, but it never said who's to pay for it. So in this case here, it identifies who's going to be paying for it, buyer, seller, or both. If there's any point of sale inspections or reports, that's where that would go in as to who's paying for that. Now, what are a point of sale inspections and reports? Well, one of them, I believe in Morgan Hills, got the sewer lateral, as well as a lot of other cities up the peninsula. So that would be a one type of point of sale activity. And then the government required point of sales would be along the not just the inspections, but if there's any repairs that need to be done, that would identify who's to pay for that too. Q7 deals with the escrow, who pays the escrow. And Q8 is title insurance. Now that varies between counties. Check with the county that you're working in to see who customarily pays for the escrow fee and the title insurance fee. Q9, different than the owner's title insurance policy, the lender requires a title policy too, and that's paid for by the buyer. And that's because of the buyer getting the loan. County transfer tax is a fee in Santa Clara County. Seller pays the county transfer tax. What is the cost of the county transfer tax in Santa Clara County? Anyone know?
Isn't it that $1.10?
$1.10 would be the county transfer tax, $1.10 per thousand. And the city transfer tax is split between the buyer and the seller. And what's the cost of that? That's $3.30.
Oh, I was going to say.
Oh, does anyone want to take a stab at what cities have a city transfer tax?
It's gonna be Mountain View, Palo Alto, and San Jose.
Mountain View, Palo Alto, San Jose. Good. Okay, that takes care of that. That's $3.30 on that. Now, San Jose has an additional transfer tax for any property that's over $2 million. So there's an additional transfer tax in more than the $3.30. So be aware of that on there. HOA fee for preparing the disclosures. The seller pays for that. That's the HOA package. Certification fee. HOA certification fee is what's needed. The certification for the lender needs that, and so that the buyer pays for that. And then HOA transfer fee could be the buyer or the seller. And then if you look on additional terms, seller shall pay for a separate HOA move-out fee, and buyer shall pay for a separate move-in fee. Kind of makes sense. So if there is a move-out fee, a move-in fee, then each person pays their own fees. Private transfer fee, it's similar to a transfer tax or county or city transfer tax, except that it's private. And most of the homes, most of the properties don't have private transfer fees. It's you see them in properties that were built in the Central Valley at around 1995 to 2005, and it was just basically a self-imposed transfer fee that the builder put it on the complex or the development in order that some person or some entity gets a transfer tax every time the property is sold. It'll be in the preliminary title report and will be in the natural hazard disclosure statement as putting you on notice. So just rarely do we see them in this neck of the woods around here. Q16 and Q17 are blank, and that's where you would put in any additional amount, any added fees that you're aware of, but it's okay to leave them blank. And Q18 is the home warranty plan. And to fill this out, you have the home warranty plan, and then you would put in any extra coverage that you want to have in there under these right here for these blanks. And then basically, besides the buyer choosing the plan, who's going to be paying for the plan? So either the buyer, seller, both. And then if it is going to be a seller paying for it, it's not going to cost more than X amount of dollars. Here is where the company, that is the home protection plan, would be put in here. Issued by, or the last item could be a checkbox where the buyer waives the home warranty plan. Now, if the buyer is waiving the home warranty plan, the buyer has the right to order it before close of escrow after the contract is written, if they're going to be paying for it. But if it's not addressed in the offer, seller is not going to be paying for it. It would be a buyer cost. Now, people ask, well, what about if the agent wants to pay? Nowhere in Q18 doesn't have where the agent is paying the plan. My suggestion would be that if that's the case, which I don't know why you would need to do that, but if you wanted to do that, you would have the buyer can waive it, and then you could order it. You could order it after the deal's accepted, and then you as the agent can pay for the plan in the closing statement and take money out of your commission to be able to do that. But it's just in Q18, it just deals with the buyer and the seller, or it's shared between both. Okay. Paragraph R is just blank for any other terms and conditions of the contract. And understand you could always put an addendum together to have it more than just the 3 lines. You'll have text overflow if you need it, and you'll be able to put everything that you need to put down. Any questions on this page? Page 3. Okay, let's move on. Page 4. Here's where all the forms that are going to be associated with the contractor are going to be in here. And you'd be checking the box to the appropriate box for the extra form. So the first part, 4A, is dealing with the property type addendums. So any addendums that you would put in here, one of them is that TOPA, which is the tenant occupied property, which would be checked. If it's a probate, if it's a manufactured home, are probably the main 3 that you'll see as far as addendums are. And then other addendums would be just the first one, addendum number. That's the blank addendum where you would put numbers 1 or 2 or whatever you're going to be putting in there, probably mostly just 1. And then you have other addendums, whether it's a backup offer, if there's a septic tank on there, if it's going to be an exchange, a 1031 exchange, there's an addendum for that. Short sale addendum, court confirmation addendum if there is going to be the court involved, and the other 1031 for a seller intent on that. And then there's a box for any other addendum that you want to put in there. So those are the 2 types of addendums that are broken up in A and B. Paragraph C would be seller's advisories or buyer and seller advisories. And there are some that are already checked that are included with the contract purchase agreement. And that's the Form BIA, the wire fraud advisory, the fair housing, and the consumer privacy. So those are automatic, but you could any other type of advisories. If it is a probate, you not only have a probate addendum, but you also have a advisory. So just different things in there, and of course any other advisories that you wanted to put in there. So paragraph 4 is broken up into advisories and addendums. It's nice because it's all centrally located in one spot.
And
okay.
And Mike, if you had your buyer signing as a corporation, would you put that on the A or the B in other, or does it matter?
You don't need it. As a corporation, you would have you would be able to handle it in where the buyer signs on there and it states what they're signing on behalf of. You also have the what is the form? I'll get to that form, but you don't. But they changed the contract, so you don't need that form. It's a representative capacity.
Yeah. So that I don't need that anymore.
No, if you use the contract, you could use it if you want to. But the purchase agreement allows you to not have to have a representative capacity agreement anymore. It's in the body of the contract.
Oh, okay. And that's a change.
And I'll show you. I'll show you when we get there.
Okay, but that is a change, right? Because I've had to use it before.
Yes, when the representative capacity first came out, it was not adjusted in the contract, and so you had that, but you don't need it. You don't need it now if you utilize the purchase agreement the right way.
Great.
Okay. Paragraph 5 is a recap of what we went over yesterday, but it explains in further detail, and basically talks about the initial deposit, increased deposit, and the retention of deposit. So we covered, I thought, the initial deposit yesterday, the increased deposit needing that form DID to make that part of liquidated damages. Right. And then the retention of the deposit is we'll cover it more when we get to the paragraph that is liquidated damages towards the end of our class. But there's nothing that is non-refundable without having to go through. You're going to have to go through the process for a seller to collect a deposit. It's not automatic in residential real estate in California. So there's a process that we'll go over when we go over liquidated damages. We talked about an all cash offer. There's no loan involved, and there's no contingencies regarding a loan contingency. Loans, we talked about the first loan, and the terms of the first loan is different than the terms of the additional financing amount, which is the second. The buyer's loan status is that the seller has the right to contact the buyer's lender to ask questions about the loan, and now it's in the contract that allows the seller to be able to do that, or the seller's agent to be able to contact the lender on that. If the FHA or VA is checked, there's going to be, if you're getting a FHA or VA loan, there's going to be the appraiser that's going to be putting a list together of what the home needs to get repaired. And that list, the default is 17 days. It's going to go to the seller. Does not say the seller has to make those repairs, just says that those repairs are identified as having to be done. Buyer can still pay for those repairs. Balance of purchase price, that's the rest of the down payment. That's going to go to in escrow. Limits on credits to buyer. We talked about yesterday, if you remember, that there could be a credit the seller's giving the buyer, but it has to be lender approved, and the lender limits the amount of credits the seller can give to the buyer. The reason they limit it is because the lender wants to make sure that the buyer has their down payment covered in there, like 10 or 20 or whatever the down payment is. When it wants to make sure, figure this scenario, if I'm buying a house for $1 million and the value of the home is I tell the seller, why don't you, I'll pay you $1,100,000 and you give me $100,000 credit for credit back. I'm getting a loan, 80% loan based on 1.1, and I'm really buying the house for only 1 million. So the lender wants to make sure that 20% or whatever the down payment percentage is intact. So there's a limit on how much the credit from the seller to the buyer is going to be. Usually it's closing costs. So what this is saying is the limits on the credits to the buyer. If the credit is more than what the lender allows, that is all that the seller is going to give to the buyer. He's not going to give them under the table, a side note, check, or whatever. The credit is the credit, and that's it. So if a buyer negotiates $100,000 credit and the lender only allows $10,000, that's all the seller is obligated to give to the buyer. Additional financing terms. We talked about the verification of the down payment and closing costs as well. That we like to have it with the default is with the purchase agreement that verification is going to be done, as well as the verification of the loan application. That's where that we have that pre-qualification, pre-approval, or fully underwritten. So that's what that is talking about, and that the buyer is going to give it to the seller. We like to have it upon the presentation of the offer. Any questions on 4? A lot of the stuff that is covered in here is just really, in these paragraphs, we covered a lot of it in paragraph 3, but it's more expansive in here. And it's not something that you can't eliminate talking to your seller or buyer regarding these paragraphs. You need to go over this information with your client as well when you're reviewing the offer. Paragraph C, the buyer is putting the financing down in paragraph 3, and this is the buyer's state of financing. This is what everyone is going based on. If the buyer changes the financing, then that loan contingency might be in jeopardy, and that might not be an out for the buyer to utilize that contingency if they're changing what they stated to actually what they're getting rejected on. So make sure that what you fill out in paragraph 3 is the right type of financing that the buyer is going to be getting. Paragraph 7 is the closing and possession. We talked about the occupancy, that if there is someone other than the seller occupying the property, you need to have a TOPA, which is that the tenants in possession agreement. So that also includes adult children of the seller or tenants. So make sure that if it is occupied by other than the seller, then the TOPA is utilized. Even if that person is going to move out prior to close of escrow, it's on the date of the offer being made as to determining whether you need a TOPA or not. Any questions on the TOPA? Okay. Conditions of the property is going to be as is. The seller is required to keep the property in the same condition as what it was upon the acceptance date. That means that sparkling pool needs to be maintained, and if the seller doesn't maintain it at close of escrow, it's green and mucky, that seller is responsible for putting back in the same condition. Same thing with the landscaping, grass, things like that. All the personal debris is to be removed. So just because it says as is, doesn't mean that the garbage isn't cleaned up. And if you have a concern about that, put it in the offer that all garbage shall be removed prior to close of escrow. But it is in the contract here that that it's done. The only reason you put it in there again would be if there's a concern that you feel that the seller is not seeing this as debris and seeing this as landscaping. Seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. We talked about, well, 3 forms that are used. We have one form, which is the KW form, which is for anything under 60 days for a seller occupying the property. We have 2 other forms from CAR. One is for 29 days or less. Which form is that being used? 29 days or less. That's the SIP form, seller in possession. Anything that is for 30 days or more is the RLAS. That form is a more it's got more pages, it's more in depth, and it's probably about, I think, 5 or 6 pages. But you need to have one of those agreements in writing if the seller is not vacating at close of escrow. Okay, close of escrow, seller is going to assign any warranty rights to the buyer, whether it's assignable or not. Mr. Buyer, you're getting them. Here you go. Seller is not guaranteeing that these warranties are assignable, but you got them anyway. Seller needs to give. This is an important one, guys. It's really minor, but there's a lot of dispute over this. Paragraph E. Seller shall, on close of escrow, and even if the seller remains in possession, provide the keys. So how many times do I hear that it closes escrow and the seller says, I'm not giving you a key because I'm staying in the property 30 days. I'll give it to you in a month. Well, have them go back to what they agreed upon, which is paragraph 7, paragraph E. And it's stating that the seller shall give the keys to the buyer at close of escrow. Whether they're staying in the property or moving out, they're giving the keys at close of escrow. And if the seller doesn't want to do that, they don't have to accept this contract. They can counter that out. And as long as both parties agree to the terms, then you're okay. Other things, they need to turn over garage door openers. They need security systems. You could read paragraph E for yourself about all the things that are included to transfer over, codes, that type of stuff. Paragraph 8 is contingencies and removal of contingencies. We talked earlier about the 2 contingencies that you don't need a contingency release form is the loan and the appraisal, and that's in the contract on paragraph 3, little check boxes. Everything else you need to have a contingency removal form, a CR form. So in this paragraph A, it talks about loan and appraisal are 2 separate contingencies. So if the home doesn't appraise for the purchase price, the buyer can't use the loan contingency as an excuse to get out of the contract. It's 2 separate standalone contingencies. I think that's one of the most important things in there. It talks about other than the loan, it also talks about that some contingencies could include the ability to get insurance, not just the condition of the home, but other things, the neighborhood, things like that should be part of the investigation of the property. and then you got the appraisal is the house, whether it appraises or not at the purchase price, if that's a contingency or not. Talked about the loan. Review of seller documents, and that's the seller's disclosures. And then, yeah,
Mike,
question?
I have a question. Yes.
Yeah.
Just the top page about the keys, if they're going to stay back, you
Yeah.
get the key and then you give it back to them. Is that how it works?
No, at
Okay.
close of escrow, paragraph E is not changed at all. It's saying at close of escrow, the buyer is entitled to the keys of the property. They're now the owner of the property, and it would be no different than if it was a landlord-tenant relationship. Landlords have keys to their own houses. So
So-
you would pick up the key, give it to the buyer.
Okay, and then if the seller is staying back, you make a copy of the key and then give that
No,
back?
no.
How?
All the buyer needs is just one key.
Okay,
He doesn't need all the keys. And I'm sure the seller has more than one key. And the seller gives a key to the buyer.
Okay.
That's what the requirement is.
okay, thank you.
Sure. Review of seller documents means the seller's disclosures are being reviewed. Title, you get a preliminary title report, you review that. If it's an HOA, paragraph F is the HOA package is reviewed on that. Paragraph G is if there's a solar or any leased items, you review the contract on that. And for example, a solar, it's a contingency like anything else. And if the buyer doesn't like the solar agreement, on the lease solar agreement, they have the right, it's a contingency, and they have the right, if they use the contingency, to cancel the contract. So usually the solar agreements are part of the disclosure package so that buyers get to see that right away. But the problem with leased solar systems is that it goes with the house, and the buyer's obligated to pay that monthly charge unless it's going to be paid off. If it's not going to be paid off, the buyer is obligated to take over those payments. I've seen transactions blow up because of this solar lease. A removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer. There's the buyer removing contingencies should only remove contingencies if they have all the disclosures and all the responsibility. If the seller did not give the information and it's not there yet, I wouldn't remove contingencies in an HOA when I don't have the HOA package. So don't remove the HOA review of the HOA package if you don't have it. You can remove other contingencies, but leave that contingency alone. And that's with anything that the seller hasn't provided. I wouldn't remove the leased or liened contingency if I don't have a firm understanding of the solar contract. So this is telling you don't remove the contingencies if you don't have all the information from the seller. We talked yesterday about what's included and excluded from the sale. On the bunch of those check boxes. I told you the experience that we had in the office on other items that were provided, that the agent said that these go with the property. but yet we didn't tie him to the contract. So it could have got into a problem. So just make sure everything is included in the purchase agreement to make sure that buyer and seller are in agreement on this. Okay. And paragraph B talks more in depth about what is included in the property. What, you know, TVs, whether they're included, the garage door openers, the pool covers, air conditioners. You could read it in paragraph 2, everything that is included normally with the property. Again, if there's things that a buyer wants to have with the sale, put them down as in the blanks included with the sale. If the seller wants things that they want to take out that are normally included, and the buyer's okay with that, then it should be identified as to what's included and excluded in the sale. Okay. Let's talk about paragraph C, items excluded from the sale. So all items specified in paragraph 3P2, we talked about the audio and video components, flat screen TV, speakers, and other items. They're not included in the sale. However, it talks about and it identifies even more. We talked yesterday about everything that's attached to the property stays. Well, TVs are attached with a bracket. However, the TV is not included on that, even though it's attached to the bracket. It identifies it and spells it out in paragraph C. So if there's ever a question, please read these paragraphs. These paragraph 9 is real important so that you don't have a problem at the end of the day and the close of escrow with what is staying and what is going. So and item C at the bottom, unless otherwise specified, brackets attached to the walls will be removed. So the bracket, the TV and the brackets aren't included unless you specifically say that they're to stay. And the funny thing that I love is that the holes will be repaired but not painted. And the reason they don't include the painting, because then there's a big problem between the buyer and the seller that this didn't match, this color wasn't the same. And you know, a lot of times when you retouch a paint job, it doesn't exactly match. So that's why they said that it's not the responsibility of the seller to paint those repairs. Allocation of costs. Again, these are costs for the tests and the reports, has nothing to do with the repairs of the property on here. It gets into a little bit about the point of sale requirements. We talked about some of the point of sale requirements that are, you know, as of 6 months ago, there was no point of sale requirements in Santa Clara County, but now Morgan Hill has point of sale requirements, and that's the sewer laterals. And I envision that that's going to be throughout the whole Bay Area on that. So look for those things, and it's especially important if you're doing a transaction in a certain area, make sure there may be some other point of sale requirements that are not normally known in Santa Clara County, but could be affected in other areas as well.
And again, are those going to be in the preliminary title and the NHD?
No, not for point of sale requirements.
So where would you find that?
You would find it from the municipality. Pacific Grove has a sewer lateral requirement for inspection prior to close of escrow. So you would have to go to the, hopefully you're conducting business in an area that you know. But if you're conducting a business in an area that you don't know, you better get to know what the local codes and requirements are. Let's talk about statutory and other disclosures. You can
Mike?
see in paragraph 8. I'm sorry.
I
What
have
was
a
that?
I have a quick question about the sewer lateral.
Yeah.
Who pays for that? Buyer or seller?
It's negotiable, but usually the seller pays for that.
Okay, thank you.
There's two things. There's a sewer lateral inspection, and then there could be repairs.
Okay, so for the repairs, who pays for that?
It's negotiable, but I would say that it would be a seller cost.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Let's talk about the, so all these disclosures, that they're statutory disclosures. One of the biggest ones is the TDS. That's a by law, the seller, unless they're exempt, has to complete a TDS. And that's a transfer disclosure statement. It's a form that CAR cannot touch. Only the state, Sacramento is the only entity that could change that form. So the law is that the seller has to disclose all material facts of the property. They have to give the completed TDS to the buyer. And the buyer has 3 days or 5 days, depending on how they receive the form, the ability to cancel the contract without any excuses. So what's a completed TDS? A completed TDS is where the seller answers every question, every box is checked, and identifies if there's a box that's checked yes, has to expand on that answer in the comment section. That's what the seller's obligation is. The seller's agent's obligation is to also complete his portion of the TDS. Once the seller and the seller's agent complete the TDS, it is a completed TDS. In the eyes of this contract, the seller and the seller's agent need to complete it. The buyer's agent does not have to complete the TDS in order to be viewed as a completed TDS. That is not true with the neighboring contract, the PRDS contract, which states by their rules that a completed TDS is the seller's agent, and buyer's agent. So there's a difference in definition between the two purchase agreements. Now, why is that important? Because the 3 days starts ticking, or the 5 days starts ticking on a part of the buyer being able to cancel based on receiving a completed TDS. So if a seller does not give a TDS or a completed TDS, that clock has not started ticking yet. It's our job as an agent to make sure the seller has completed every single question. Okay, why is it important regarding the TDS? Well, because it's state law, number one. And number two, any material fact is through the course of the escrow. So in other words, if something happens that the seller finds out about after the deal is accepted and we're in the escrow period and something happens that the seller finds out about, he's required to disclose a material fact. And the way to do that is an amended or a new transfer disclosure statement. What happens when a buyer gets a transfer disclosure statement or an amended transfer disclosure statement? It starts the 3 or 5 day process again. And the buyer has the right to terminate the contract, get their deposit back. No questions asked when they get a TDS. And they have the right to cancel. Everyone understand that? The TDS is important?
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah.
I have a quick question here. So in that sentence, there is the part it says unless exempt. Can you touch on
Yes.
that? Because a lot of people are out of state.
No.
And they don't-
Exempt.
Uh-huh.
Exempt from the TDS would be only a few things. I'll give you a couple examples. A foreclosure, where say a bank forecloses on a property, they are exempt from a TDS. A probate sale, or someone that's passed away someone's passed away, the heirs are exempt from a TDS. Those would be 2 examples.
So I had this example or encounter with this lady, the agent, that says the owner, she was the listing agent, and she said the owner is out of state, so they have no idea what's happening in the house, so they cannot fill out the TDS.
Well,
How do you
that's wrong.
respond to
I
Yeah.
respond by saying the laws of the law. It doesn't matter. I have an aunt that hasn't been in the property for 40 years. That doesn't relieve her from filling out the transfer disclosure statement. Because
Understood.
she's not exempt. She's the owner of the
So
property.
they have to fill it
But
out no matter what?
It's required by law.
Yes, thank you.
Now, again, what the TDS is the burden on the owner or the seller. The seller's required to disclose what they know. And if they don't know, they don't know, but they're still required to give a TDS. Now, there are some, I talked about if there's a new thing that is discovered that the seller is obligated to give a new TDS or an amended TDS, there's an exception to that. And that exception is seller has to disclose it if they find out about it, not if a buyer finds out about it. If a buyer finds out about it, that does not constitute the seller requiring to do a new TDS. I'll give you an example. Seller gives a TDS. Buyer looks at the TDS, gets an inspector to come into the property. The inspector says, I discovered that there's a big foundation crack. Buyer says to the seller, hey, we found a foundation crack. I want a new TDS. Seller says, no, I'm not going to give it to you because I didn't know anything about that. You discovered it, Mr. Buyer, not me. I'm not required to give a TDS. You want to know the importance of giving a new TDS is so important because that gives the buyer the right to back out of the contract. So in this case I just gave you, if the buyer removed all his contingencies, which he should not have done, and then got an inspection to see something was wrong, that doesn't give a free ride to the buyer to back out of the deal, because it was discovered by the buyer, not by the seller. Okay, so just understand that if the seller discovers new material fact, they are required to give a new TDS. If the buyer discovers it, the seller is not required to give a new TDS. Give an example of something that happens that the seller discovers. Seller wakes up one morning, we're in escrow, and discovers that someone was shot in his front porch. Is that a material fact?
Yes.
Yes. Seller needs to let the buyer know that they found that there's a new material fact and the new TDS. If they give a new TDS or amended TDS, does the buyer have a right to back out and get their deposit back?
Yes.
Yes. Let's change it around. The buyer wants to get out of a contract. He hires Meg Apple and say, Meg, I want you to go underneath the house, find a foundation crack. Every house has hairline foundation cracks. And I want you to write a report and tell me about it. So Meg Apple does it for a little Valentine's cookie. And writes that report up. The buyer says, Mr. Seller, we have a problem with your house. You have a foundation crack. I want a new TDS. What is the seller? What can the seller say?
I did.
I don't care. I am not filling out a new TDS. You discovered it. I didn't discover it. End of story. Okay. Make sure that you guys get that in your head as to what's required of a seller to give a new TDS and what is not required. Make sure you talk to me when you come up with that situation, if you're not sure, because it makes a big difference in representing our clients, which way it goes. Okay? Are we squared away on that?
Well, I
Any
have a quick
questions?
question. Yes, Mike.
Sure.
So in that scenario, who pays for the repair, seller or buyer?
Under what scenario?
The crack. in the
yeah.
foundation.
Uh-huh.
Well, who says anyone's paying for it?
Well,
I
yeah,
don't
well, that was
understand.
my question. Like, who pays for the repair?
I depends. Maybe nobody. Who said that there's an obligation to have the crack repaired? Your question is, it's based on the assumption of it could go any different way. Well, it's not addressed in the contract. So there's so many variables, terms of are contingencies removed? That might help determine whether the seller's gonna pay anything. Buyer removed all contingencies. As a seller, hey, I'm not doing anything. You shouldn't have removed your contingencies. I'm not doing anything. Either go through with this deal or give me your deposit.
Okay,
So I can't answer that question without knowing a specific case. And we don't have time today to do that specific case. So if you want to talk after with a scenario, I'd be more than happy to kind of go over it with you.
Okay. All right,
right.
thanks.
So TDS, I don't want to beat this to death, but it's an important weapon for a buyer to have. And it also need to know that there's some weapons for the seller when it comes to a TDS as well. Just know that your job is to make sure that the buyer gets the completed TDS as quickly as possible for them to review. Let me give you a scenario. We accept the deal, day 29 of a 30-day close of escrow. We're closing escrow on Tuesday. Today is Friday. And my transaction coordinator, Lindsay, says, hey, we don't have a TDS that we gave to the buyer yet. First of all, I'm going to be mad at Lindsay for that, but ultimately it's my fault. But what do we have to do? All contingencies are removed. The buyer's ready to move in on Tuesday. I have to give a TDS to the buyer. It's completed. The seller filled out everything. The seller's agent filled out everything. I give it to the buyer. What can the buyer do?
Walk
Closing escrow
away.
Tuesday. They remove their contingency.
They still got 5 days.
What can the buyer do?
He can walk away if he wants.
He can say, goodbye. I want my deposit back quickly as possible. And he's entitled to do that. So is it important that we make sure the buyer gets the TDS early in the process?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on. That's all I wanted dwell on this anymore on this, but it's an important, I spent way too long, but it's so important that as part of our process representing the seller or the buyer, that these disclosures get taken care of. Lead disclosures, that there's a lead disclosure, home fire hardening disclosure and advisory, and defensible space, very complicated forms. The only concern that you have to have is if it's in a high fire zone, then these forms are used. If it's not a high fire zone, you do not need to use these forms. Let's see. With withholding taxes, that's where we have what's called a FERPTA. You guys familiar with FERPTA? And that's where the seller signs that they are a U.S. tax-paying citizen. If they're not, the title company or escrow company is required to withhold proceeds from the sale so that the taxes are going to be paid for by the seller on that. And they put the burden on the buyer and the agents and the title companies for the seller to fill out that affidavit on that. And as long as the title company, we don't even fill out the FERPTA in a lot of cases. We just need to make sure that we get the affidavit from the title company that they have the social security number and that the seller has filled out their version of the FERPTA, and we're good to go. So, but just make sure that we get the affidavit from the title company, or we have our own FERPTA that we get the sellers to sign. The FERPTAs that we get from the sellers do not have their social security number on them. Megan's Law, we want to make sure that we convey to the buyers that there's an avenue that they could check out for any sexual predators living in the area. They can get access to meganslaw.ca.gov, and they can do any investigations that they want to do regarding that. We don't do the investigation. Our role is to let the buyers know that they can do that. We're not going to do it. Any questions on that? Paragraph J talks about the gas transmission lines. Remember years ago, San Bruno blew up because they had a high transmission gas line. Well, we have them down in our areas as well. In the natural hazard disclosure statement, they will identify any gas line, not specific where it is, but within a half mile of the property, or I think it's a half mile. And the buyer has a right to see that. The reason they don't identify exactly where it is because of the threat of a terrorist threat or something like that. So it's something for the buyer, if they have concerns, that they can get more information, and they can look to see that there is if there is a high transmission gas line in the area. K is natural and environmental hazards. That's the natural hazard disclosure statement. They could talk about, which talks about whether it's an earthquake zone, in a flood zone, high fire zone, things like that. It's not an expensive report, but it comes up with a lot of information on that. L is the HOA disclosures, and what is included in the HOA disclosures. What should be part of that HOA package, and that package includes the minutes, which I think are the most important thing that you can find out about an HOA. It will be in the minutes at these board meetings. It's got the financials, it's got the CC&Rs or the rules and regulations. It's got everything in that paragraph about what is included in there. And it's important for a buyer to go over these items because, for instance, the CC&R might determine if they can do what they want to do in the property. Number two, the financials are important because somebody buying a property in an HOA that where the HOA doesn't have any money to do the long-term repairs that it's going to be required to do, that they're going to ask for the money sooner or later. Someone's got to pay for it. And there could be a special assessment that's levied on each homeowner. And I've seen special assessments go from $25,000, $50,000. It could be, well, let's talk about the Florida where that condominium crashed and the house, the whole complex just disintegrated. These other HOAs now in Florida, they're coming up with their fits, and there's $150,000 that they're going to be assessing the condos to repair things so it doesn't, same thing does not happen again. So anyway, so it's important to look at the financials, what the budgets are, and the financial strength of the HOA also determines how valuable your unit is. Something that is in financial disarray might not be worth the money that the seller is currently asking for your property. Okay. The one thing I want to go back to TDS again. I'm sorry for doing this, but we talked about who's exempt and who's not exempt. The law is clear. Whether you're exempt or not exempt, if the seller knows of a material fact, by law, they are required to disclose that. So that person that of the estate that knows a material fact, even though they don't have to give a TDS, they're still required to disclose that material fact. A bank that just took the property back in foreclosure, they don't have to do a transfer disclosure statement, but they're still by law required to disclose a material fact to the buyer. Sorry for going back, but I wanted to catch that with N kind of got me no material facts. Okay, buyer's investigation of the property. Buyer has the right to conduct any and all investigations that they want to do to the property. The only two things that they can't do is they can't bring a government agency to the property without the seller's permission. So in other words, if the buyer says, I'm not sure if this was built up to code or with a permit, they can't bring the city out to conduct an investigation. That's one thing they can't do. The other thing that they're not allowed to do is the buyer, when they're conducting investigations, can't conduct an investigation that is that harms the property. In other words, any invasive type of investigation. In other words, say I have a 40-foot high retaining wall. I don't know how it's built, so I want to knock down half the wall to see how it's built. I can't do that. So those are the two things that a buyer cannot do without the approval of the seller. And but they can do anything else. The paragraph E in there is indemnifying, and that basically is legal terms, so that allows the seller, and the seller feels comfortable to have people go into the property as long as they're indemnified in case someone gets hurt, killed, or whatever. That the buyer's going to indemnify the seller on people getting in there on that. Let's talk about repairs. Now, in some cases, repairs are done prior to close of escrow. We know they're done on a VA and FHA loan when there's required repairs done. and the buyer's making the repairs. This contract allows the buyer to do those repairs, but if there's going to be any repairs done on a part of the buyer prior to them owning the property, we want to have a CAR form NNR, notice of non-responsibility. As a seller's agent, you want to make sure that you get that NNR completed by the buyer to protect your seller's interests. And again, it's only done when the buyer is making the repairs, not when the seller's making the repairs. And only done when the buyer's making the repairs prior to them owning the property. It's in paragraph E. And you'll be able to see that. Rarely, not many times do we see repairs being done by the buyer prior to close. But if there is one, make sure you have that form done. Any questions on 12? Okay, let's go on.
Yeah, I have something. If
Sure.
if there is a further investigation in the existing investigation report, meaning the inspection report, and then
Sure.
we end up cutting something on the drywall or something, and then find termites, for example, and is that something legal to do, or is there any form we need to fill up?
No, but let's, I need to know more of what's going on. Who's responsible for the repairs? No one? Or is the seller responsible for repairs?
I'm just asking a scenario. If we are
I
entitled to
get
do,
that. I need to expand your scenario to
Okay.
see if there's, who's responsible for the repairs? The seller responsible, or there's no one's responsible? And your scenario.
so it's not, we can't put that on the agreement too, right?
Let me take a step back.
Okay.
Buyer does further investigation, uncovers something, sees that there's repairs, that there's termites. You didn't tell me that the seller is responsible for repairs if they find something. So I'm going on the assumption that the buyer just did an investigation and nothing needs to be done as long as the buyer's buying the property. If the buyer is not buying the property, he needs to get it back to the original condition as what it was.
Okay,
How's that?
so he's responsible to fix it if he's not
The
buying the
buyer's-
property.
If he backs out of the deal, he's responsible for getting it back to the original condition.
Got it. Thank you.
I'll give you an example. I had the buyer got a termite inspection and one termite and the contract calls for the seller to do the section 1 termite clearance, which was our investigator said that it was a rotted bathroom floor. Their termite company said that the floor is fine. We had 2 termite companies meet, and one guy and the termite company said, I called the floor, I'm saying that it's bad. What he did was he got his knife out, opened up the linoleum floor. Now, the agreement was that the seller was going to repair if there was damage. There was no damage. So the termite company that said there was damage, opened it up, discovered there was no damage. The buyer the buyer and the seller looked at the termite guy. If the buyer didn't buy the property, the seller would have demanded that the buyer put in replace the linoleum floor. As it turned out, being that there was no damage, the termite company said, I ruined it and I'm gonna give you a new floor. So I did want to become a detective on your scenario, but it just depends subtly on what the issues are.
Okay, got it.
Okay, let's talk about title investing. When you get into a contract, when you No, before you get into making an offer, there's usually sellers has a disclosure package. And part of the disclosure package is the preliminary title report. It's good to see what's on the preliminary title report. However, once you get into the contract and you make, and you buyer and seller agree to execute a contract, within a few days, the title company will give you a new preliminary title report. And it'll have your buyer's names on the first page. That's the title report that I want submitted to the file, because that's the title report that's going to be issuing the title insurance will be off that report, not the original report that that the seller got. We want the one with your buyer's names on that. And you need to review it, because there could be different things on that report that may not be on the original report. So that's the one thing that is real important when you're dealing with an escrow. I want the new title insurance preliminary title report put into our transaction. And I want you to go over the new title report with your buyers. Number two.
Lindsay's aware of that.
She should be, but make sure that you do it with, make sure you go over with her.
Okay, I'm
Actually,
just,
you'll be getting the updated title report. Give it to Lindsay and you share it with your buyer and go over it with your buyer.
okay, I'm just thinking that
Thank-
since it's your sort of, it sounds like sort of your policy that, and she's, so many
Policy,
transactions are going through her.
Yeah, that's not my policy, Steve. That is what the title insurance is going to be issuing, that the insurance is going to be issued off of that preliminary title report with your buyer's names on it.
Sure.
So it's not Lindsay's job to go over it with your buyer. It's the agent's job.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, all right. Let's but a lot of people overlook that because they get the original one and they think this is a duplicate and they erase it. Don't do that. There could be a reason that second title report may be different than the first one. I'll give you it never happened to me, but this could. Two neighbors been living together, living next door to each other for 40 years. One neighbor gave the other neighbor an easement, but it was never recorded, but it's an easement. And what happens is the one neighbor sees the one that gave him an easement, there's a for sale sign in front of their property. And the next door neighbor says, hey, I got this easement that I'm using, but I never recorded it. I better record it because there's going to be a new owner living next door. So he goes down to the county, records the easement, and now it's a new easement that wasn't on the easement when the seller opened up the escrow. So things can change, and under that scenario, I see it could easily change. So it's real important that the agent goes over the revised or updated preliminary title report when you get that email, and it's usually a couple days after the title and escrow find out about the sale. The last thing I want to talk about title investing is there are, I don't know how many, 7 different ways of vesting. It's single person, that's easy, where sole and separate property. But 2 people buying the property together can be a whole bunch of different ways. Tenants in common, community property. I think there's 7 of them, and there could be subtle differences. So it's important that we consult with our buyers to have them consult before we sign the loan documents or the title documents as to which is the best way for them to take title, what vesting. We don't know. We're not experts, but an accountant, an attorney, they're the ones that know better because it involves when someone dies. How is the other person gonna get it? So please do yourself a favor and make sure you consult with your clients that they need to consult with their attorney or with the CPA or their accountant as the best way that they should take title to the real estate they're going to own. It's gonna that question's gonna come up when they sign their documents. Any questions on that? Let's talk about removing contingencies. Basically, in paragraph 14, it talks about that the seller's obligated through paragraph 3 yesterday as to when they need to get all the documents to the buyer. And at the same time, so many days after acceptance. And the contingencies are the default is 17 days after acceptance for removing contingencies. And then whatever the days are, the days are. But here's what happens. On the say we didn't change it, it's day 17. On day 17, the buyer has to either remove the contingency or cancel the contract. Or get an extension. And then the seller, based on what the buyer is doing, knows which way they're going to go. Whether they have a transaction that's going to fall apart or they have a transaction that's going to close escrow. The other thing that a buyer can do is they could ask for some sort of, if it's dealing with the investigation of property, they could ask for some compensation for the repairs. You could do a request for repair. You could ask for a credit. You could ask for, different things. And you could do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, it's either going to be a yes or no on a part of the parties. It might be a roof that needs repairs and buyer wants 5,000, seller counters at 2,500, buyer counters at 3,000. Sooner or later, there's going to be a decision made that they have an agreement or they don't have an agreement. The only exception to doing something in 17 days where you hope that someone is starting to ask for, either removing their contingency or asking for some sort of compensation or canceling the escrow is if they do nothing. And that's where coming out later in this paragraph, there's a notice to perform. So if nothing's being done in day 17, the seller can send out saying, hey, Mr. Buyer, you need to remove your contingencies, put up or shut up, either remove your contingencies or we're going to cancel the contract. So that's the notice to perform. Bottom line is, the idea is that a buyer that is going through this process wants to buy the property and the seller going through the process wants to sell their property. So it comes to some sort of agreement or the right to cancel. So let's go through the scenario that day 17 comes, buyer removes his contingencies. Perfect. Seller moves on, we close escrow. Buyer doesn't remove the contingencies and doesn't like the property and doesn't want to buy the property, sends a cancellation. We know where we're going. Seller either puts the property back on the market or takes it off the market, whatever he's going to do. But those are definitive actions. The third thing where the buyer is wants to get, as I said, a request for repair, it's going to eventually get to a definitive action where there's going to be an agreement or it's going to be no, and it's a cancellation. So the fourth thing that a buyer can do is he can ask for repairs and the seller can ignore them. Does not have to respond to the buyer's request. Now, again, it's happened before, but my thought is that everyone wants to go through this process. They want to either buy it or sell it, but understand that a seller does not have to respond to a buyer request. And then we'll just simply give them the notice to perform, whether you put up or shut up. That is an option in this contract. Every action that a buyer is supposed to do that he does not do has to be, the seller has to give a notice to perform. And that starts not just on contingency removals, but just simply putting the earnest money deposit up. If the default on the contract says within 3 days, the buyer is going to put up their initial deposit. Well, if they don't do that, seller has to say, hey, you didn't do that, notice to perform. Either you put up the money or we're going to cancel the contract. Every action the buyer is required to do is done by a notice to perform, except one action. Anyone want to take a stab at what the action is? Every action the buyer is supposed to do in the contract, except for one.
Close of escrow.
Close of escrow. Close of escrow requires a separate document called the demand to close escrow. Totally different verbiage, different times. It's instead of 2 days, it's 3 days. And if you give a notice to perform, instead of demand to close escrow, it's meaningless. It means nothing. No clock is ticking. And until you give the right demand to close escrow, everything is in limbo. So there's two forms for an action for a buyer to do, either the notice to perform or the demand to close escrow. Now, the notice to perform gives you the power to give that notice to perform 2 days prior to the action. So if it's a 17-day contingency, the seller in day 15 can give that notice to perform to the buyer, saying, hey, in 2 days, put up or shut up. Can't do it any sooner than that. It's 2 days. Any questions on the difference between notice to perform and demand to close?
No.
Pretty powerful tools on that. And I'm trying to see where I have that in the contract. I'm kind of all over the board on this paragraph 14. Hold on a second. G is demand to close escrow. E is a buyer to perform. Actually, notice to perform can be given by a buyer to a seller also. Also, demand close escrow, we think that it's the buyers that are sometimes holding up things. It could be the seller too. So that form goes both ways. To a buyer or a seller can give that notice or demand on that. The one thing is the effects of when a buyer removes his contingencies, we want to make sure in the contract that the effect of removal of contingencies is basically saying, Mr. Buyer, if you're removing your contingencies, you have done your due diligence, you have done your studies, and you are removing your contingencies based on your actions. Now, don't come back to us and say, I didn't know what I was doing, I just did it. To be honest with you, that's a defense that we hear every once in a while in mediation. So anyway, the important thing is when it's time to act and do something and the buyer doesn't do it, the seller needs to be on purpose and do it, notice to perform. They just can't simply cancel the contract based on non-performance. There needs to be a process. So, we hear where a seller wants to cancel the contract because the buyer didn't put his deposit in. Well, you just can't do that. You have to give the buyer the notice first. And then you have to wait 2 days. And it's not 48 hours, it's 2 days. Okay, repairs. In some instances, there's gonna be some repairs to the property that the seller is gonna make in negotiations after the property, the contract's been accepted. In the CAR contract, the seller can do those repairs. In the PRDS contract, it has to be a licensed contractor. So in this contract, the seller can make those repairs. They're gonna try to match it the best they can. For example, if there's carpeting or if there's tile, they try to use the same lot, but even if you match it the best you can, it still may appear differently because of dye lots and things like that. So that's what this paragraph 15 says, is that it may not match, but everyone's trying to do the best they can. If the seller does the repairs, he's going to provide the invoices as to what and the date and the invoices of the repairs. Paragraph 16, we talked about this yesterday about that walkthrough. They changed the verbiage to be 5 days prior to acceptance, and this walkthrough is not a final verification of condition, is not a contingency. But it's just a verification that the work has been done or the condition is the same as what it was when they went into escrow. What the good news about the 5 days, if you do that walkthrough and you discover that it's not to what it should be, there's a hole in the wall or there's some damage, it gives enough time to either get the repairs done or other things can be done, maybe a holdback on some money in escrow to make sure that the job does get done, or some action can be done. Now, sometimes nothing is done, and in that case, the buyer doesn't have a right, it's not a contingency where they can cancel the contract. But what they ultimately, the end result, if nothing's done, the ultimate result is that the buyer has the right to small claims court to go after the seller for items that are wrong in the verification of condition. Any questions on that? Okay. Remember, the obligation on the part of the seller is to maintain the property in the same condition as what it was at the time that the offer was accepted. We talked about it. Remember that sparkling pool, the grass, green grass, everything like that. It needs to be in the same condition. Prorations and property tax and other items. That's basically at the close of escrow, everything that is owed is paid for by the seller, and anything after close of escrow, the buyer picks up the tab. So what do we have that's prorated? We have property taxes, we have HOA dues. That's where we have rents on the other one. The seller's entitled to the rents up until the close of escrow, and then the buyer gets the rents from close of escrow on. Compensation. Let me see. I'm trying to. Here we go. Okay, this is paragraph 18A would be if there's a buyer broker agreement. This ties it in there. There's been some new buyer broker agreements that have been put in our WIN forms. Basically, there was 3 buyer broker agreements now condensed into one with options to checkbox and make the different buyer broker agreements differently. But that's what paragraph 18 is. Paragraph B is kind of a CYA that we don't pick the price. We don't, as agents, we're not responsible for what the buyer and the seller agree to price. That's their own choosing. We don't guarantee the condition of the property. It's a giant CYA for us on that. We don't, what's fair market value? It's between you and the seller, buyer and the seller on that. Paragraph 19 basically is the title company gives them, this paragraph gives them the right to be able to do what they're doing in acting as a escrow holder for the buyer and seller. Paragraph 20, this is another CYA that the realtors put in there, is that we don't guarantee, we give you a referral for a service provider, we don't guarantee the work. 21, this is the MLS where we're asking, well, it is agreed upon by the buyer and the seller in this contract that we're going to share the information on the MLS as to what the purchase price is. Helps with our comps on there. Also deals with pictures and things like that are in the MLS. Paragraph 22 is just a attorney's fees. A prevailing party would get their attorney's fees paid for by the losing party. Now, party of the contract, we talked about this yesterday. Buyer and seller are the only people that are party to the contract. The real estate agents are not. So we are not a party to the contract. We have to use, if they're suing us, they have to use their own, they have to pay their own attorneys, and same with us. We found that to be a lot better in terms of protecting us for lawsuits. Assignments. I went into that briefly where yesterday the assignment is set up to 17 days for the seller to approve the assignment. The seller shall not unreasonably withhold, but it's a change from the old contract. The old contract didn't have that 17 days, and it just said that there could be an assignment and the seller should not unreasonably withhold. This contract says that it's got to be done, the assignment, if the buyer wants to assign it, they have to do it within the 17 days, or the seller does not have to approve the assignment. And what's an assignment? Assignment could be assigning it to a whole different party, or it could be something simple by adding maybe a spouse. That's a partial assignment. So it just varies. One of the assignments where it's kind of sticky is where someone gets in contract and then finds another buyer and doesn't close escrow, but assigns the contract to buyer number 2 and gets a fee for that. Might get a seller for 100,000 more, 200,000 more. And my advice, if that happens, let the seller know now, because they're going to find out at close of escrow, and deal with it and get it over with. So anyway, so the assignment, the important thing about the assignment is now there's a 17 days, unlike the whole term of the escrow. Any questions on that? 24, there's no discrimination. 25 is definitions of terms. The important one on this one that I like is to make sure that everyone knows that if the date falls on a weekend, it goes to the next business day. And that includes if a contingency is due to be removed on a Saturday or Sunday, it goes to the next business day. Same thing with close of escrow. I think they're trying to give us a day off if we want it. Paragraph 26, terms and conditions of the offer, everything's got to be in writing. It can be signed in counterpart, where one party signs the contract and separate papers, but the same contract, another party signs that. We don't see that much anymore with electronic signatures being so prevalent. We seem to be able to get everything on one page, but it still allows that. Everything's got to be in writing. Let's see what else. That's it. I think that's good enough. Time is of the essence. That's not us getting paid quickly. That's not what it means. What it means is that there's a timeline in a contract. From the start date, when the date of acceptance, to when action items need to take place, to close of escrow. And if those timelines are broken, you've broken the time is of the essence, and it makes it very hard to enforce the rest of the timelines. So if there is, say, 7 days to remove a contingency, and that's not happening in day 7, then you need to extend the timelines or do an action like a notice to perform or something, so that you don't break the time of the essence. I mean, here's an example. The buyer and the seller go down and do this deal, and none of the timelines are being followed. It's not 7 days for a contingency. In day 15, they decide to remove the contingency when it should have been 7. In day 20, there was another contingency, and they let it go to 28. And so nothing's been filed or followed through. And then all of a sudden, the seller goes into a panic mode because it's day 35, the close of escrow is supposed to take place in day 35, and no time in the essence has been followed. And now he wants to cancel the contract. And he goes to court, and the judge says, well, no other timelines meant anything to you. Certainly, we could go, if you went 2 weeks on these other items, the buyer will close escrow soon enough. So that's why it's important to follow the timelines. Time is the essence, and adhere to the structure of the purchase agreement. And then there's no ambiguity in terms of getting things done. So that's what time is the essence basically means. Everything needs to be done in writing too. Okay, liquidated damages. I brought this up a couple different times throughout the last few days, and it's, if you look at the paragraph, there are initials, and the same thing applies to the arbitration. There are initials, buyers and sellers initials. This is an optional paragraph, and it becomes part of the contract if both parties initial. If one party initials and the other party does not initial it, it is not part of the contract. So it's optional. The purpose of liquidated damages is that it limits, if a buyer should default on the contract, it limits the seller being able to go after the buyer for damages, limits it to either the deposit or 3%, whichever is less. That's why when we talked yesterday about deposits, we always refer to initial and additional deposits equaling 3%. Anything more than 3%, if liquidated damages is signed, that money is not going to be in dispute. So that's what this paragraph is saying. If there are damages, in other words, if the buyer defaults on the contract and there is a loss on a part of the seller for that breach, the seller is entitled to 3% of the deposit, 3% of the purchase price for the deposit, whatever that is less, that is entitled. So theoretically, if the seller experiences a $1 loss, he experienced a loss. Therefore, he's entitled to the whole 3% deposit. That's what this says. And there's examples about, having liquidated damages or not, which is better. If I'll give you an example, we're selling a property for $2 million. The buyer and seller agree to liquidated damages. There's $60,000 of deposit in escrow, and the buyer defaults after removing all his contingencies, and the seller puts it back on the market and resells it for $1.5 million. The loss on the part of the seller is $500,000. liquidated damages was signed. And so the limit that the seller can go after the buyer for is the 3% deposit or $60,000. Let's take the same scenario, $2 million, $1.5 million. Buyers and sellers agree not to have liquidated damages. Seller can go after the buyer for how much?
Whatever the law says.
Basically, at least $500,000, right? So, the theory is that liquidated damages protects the buyer from a huge potential with breach of contract. So, I don't care. I think it benefits the buyer to initial liquidated damages. But what I care about is making sure that we have a valid contract. So both parties have to have the same mind set to this. Same thing with arbitration. Arbitration needs to be agreed upon, whether there is going to be arbitration or not arbitration. And the difference between arbitration is that, well, before I go into that, any questions on liquidated damages? 3% or the deposit, whichever is less. Both parties have to agree, either initial or not initial. Okay, if there is a dispute, both buyer and seller agree to paragraph 30, which is mediation. Both parties agree to sit down before a mediator. Now, a mediator is somebody that is almost kind of like a trying to, his purpose is to try to settle the dispute. He can give his advice, but no one has to take it. It's not mandatory. So you sit in front of the mediator, you state your case, you come up with an agreement between the parties. He did his job. I'm not saying that it's a fair settlement, but his job is to settle it, whether it's fair or not. So each party, they have to go to mediation. They don't have to agree to mediation. In other words, they don't have to agree to the settlement. And they can go, say, I don't agree to it, and then it goes on to the next step. Failure to go to mediation can be very costly for the party not mediating, because it involves a lot with I don't know the formula, but something to do with legal fees. So just tell your client that you agree to do mediation. There's no initial signing or anything like that for mediation. It's gonna happen. That's what you're agreeing to. Now, if it doesn't work, mediation, the next step would be either a seller and buyer going through the courts, or going through arbitration if arbitration is agreed upon. Now, arbitration used to be cheaper and faster. I'm not so sure how much cheaper it is these days, but that was the benefit of arbitration. The negative to arbitration is that instead of a mediator, it is an arbitrator. His ruling is binding. It is done. The drawbacks to an arbitration is that it's extremely hard to appeal, and the arbitrator doesn't have to follow the court of law. So there could be prior cases, court cases, which would defend your action, and the arbitrator could rule against you. So those are the two big differences. It is cheaper and it is faster than going through the courts. With that said, we don't care if buyers and sellers want arbitration or don't want arbitration, as long as they both are in agreement, whether they have it or not. It's like, it's a deal point. You might as well be off $100,000 on a price if you have an argument about who's having arbitration, who doesn't want to have arbitration. It is a deal point that needs to be agreed upon. So If there is a problem, the first step is mediation. After mediation, if that doesn't work, then it's either arbitration or court. And depending on what the contract said. Now, as a side note, if you agree not to have arbitration in the contract, a year later, when this problem comes up, you both can agree at that time to have arbitration, and that's fine. But the important thing is that you both have to agree to whether it's arbitration or not during the contract. Any question on arbitration? The difference between mediation and arbitration? Everyone understand the difference? Two things. One thing that you don't need mediation and you don't need arbitration. There's exemptions to both, and that is small claims court. So small claims court eliminates the need to go to mediation, eliminates the need for arbitration. Any questions? Okay, after mediation, arbitration, dispute, this is where paragraph 32, where the buyer signs the offer. He initials all the pages to the contract, pages 1 through 15. And then he's, was it Meg that you had a question regarding representative capacity?
Yeah, I was asking
Okay.
about whether we needed to put that in that addendum.
Got it. Okay, so paragraph 32, paragraph B, if you have a representative capacity need, you would check the box. Right there, and you don't need the representative capacity agreement anymore.
Oh, okay, cool.
And then you'd fill out paragraphs B 1 through 5. Okay, now you
Okay.
still can create a representative, an RCSD, but it's not necessary now with this way this contract is written. Just check the box and fill it out.
Right, okay. I
Okay.
mean, your
All right.
buyer is still gonna have to produce everything to the escrow anyway, but that's fine.
Yes, but for the purposes of the purchase agreement, you don't need any more. Now, I
Okay.
mean, yeah, if you're doing a power of attorney, the escrow company is going to want to see that. If it's a corporation, that the escrow company is going to want to make sure that the person signing has the power
Right,
and the trust and all that is going to have to show that they have the power to
Right.
do that.
okay,
Okay, so buyer signs paragraph 32 with or without representative capacity. If they don't have any, if they're just, Joe Smith and Jane Smith, they're just signing under paragraph D. And then paragraph 33 is where the seller is either going to sign it or counter it, or agree to it or counter it or reject it. And that would be paragraph 33. So there's also, besides the counter offer, they could also say, hey, we like your offer, but we're going to take this up as a backup offer. And then you would check the box and do an addendum to that. And then again, representative capacity form is there for the seller to also utilize. And then the signature on part of the seller. If the offer is not accepted, it's rejected. That's where the signature would be made. I like the idea if the seller is not going to accept the deal or counter a deal, that it kind of completes the circle by showing the buyer that the seller has looked at the offer and does not want to, is not going to accept it, and there's no counter that's going to be made. And then depending on what's going to happen, we'll see whether the deal gets made. In the next page is the box where the representatives of the real estate agency is completed there. One of the important things is the designated electronic delivery address. I want this filled out. and I want the email filled out and the phone filled out. And with the reason for that is up until this contract, what constituted delivery of acceptance? Was it when the agent sent it to the other agent by email? And then what happened if the other agent never opened up the email? Was that delivery? It created a whole bunch of problems. So now, the ruling now is delivery of acceptance is done when the agent sends the email or the text confirming the contract, sending the contract to that email or that text now constitutes delivery. So that's why I want to make sure that we have the email or the phone number in there so that we can prove that we have the designated electronic delivery address. So there's no confusion. Please don't leave that blank when you're writing up the offer. Fill in the seller's agent's information as well. Okay, any questions on that? And you see the need to make sure that we have the delivery of acceptance. If you don't have this filled out, there's a form in zip forms that is delivery of acceptance form that would need to be used. So just save some time, just use that and be done with it. And you got it done and you got proof of the delivery is done. Escrow holder acknowledgement, they sign that, they fill that out. I really don't care. I haven't had any issues. Have you guys had any issues with escrow companies dealing with signing or that? I haven't. So it shouldn't be an issue. And then bottom of the page, buyer and seller signs. Initials. So this is the RPA. What I didn't include are some of the built-in automatic addendums or advisories like the buyer's investigation advisory and some other forms, but they are included when you print out an RPA. We got some time. Any questions that you want to go over? Any specifics that I didn't cover? I know from yesterday, we wanted to talk about fixtures and personal property. Someone wanted to talk about. I think we covered it. New disclosures, material facts, the TDS. Someone wanted stupid mistakes. I think we covered a couple of them, but I got plenty more to go over.
I was a little lost when you were talking about the TOPA and how that you were talking about how it had to do with the date of the offer, and you had to have somebody fill it out even if they were moving out.
Well, yes, the TOPA, the form is to be used in review of when the offer is made. If there is someone living in the house other than the seller,
Right.
a TOPA is required.
And
So,
but the TOPA has to be filled out. You have to give the TOPA to the seller's agent and have them do it, correct?
the TOPA is going to be completed with the offer. No.
Well, that's the part that I'm confused. So as a buyer, I'm supposed to knock on the door of the people that live there and have them fill out the TOPA.
No, you're giving the TOPA with the offer to the seller's agent.
Right.
And a TOPA is required for every scenario where where there's more than just the sell, or if it's a rental.
Hmm. Yeah.
Or someone other than the seller is living in the property.
So we're just gonna, so that form is automatic because we check the box, it's automatically generated and is presented with the offer, although we're not filling it out.
We fill out what we can, but
Right.
some of the information regarding the occupant, we really don't know.
Right, exactly. That was the part where I was getting confused.
No, but we want that TOPA signed.
Right, so we have to get on the, if they accept the offer, then they've already gotten the TOPA and it's up to that agent. And is there somewhere in, I think it has in the contract house, some timeline for them to get back?
You know, and I maybe I'd have to take a look at it. Yeah, there is. I just don't know where it shows. But yeah, it's important because the buyer needs to know that things are going to be taken care of regarding the you know, especially where we come to find out, it's not so much the tenant that's in there, but how about the adult, the relatives
Right,
that are in there that are not the seller that refuse to get out.
right, yeah, just non-cooperative tenants, no matter who they are, right?
Yeah, but you know what? It's you almost kind of you don't expect that, but you're prepared for that. But you're not prepared for when the sellers leave and they take off and yet the 35-year-old son's still in there.
Yeah, I'm not prepared for that.
Yeah, so
Okay,
there's probably, you know, not a security deposit, things like that makes it even rougher.
right.
What else?
I have a question. Mediation is built in with this form. And is
Yes.
there a possibility buyer can refuse to sign for arbitration because they want to take to small court?
You're talking, you started off with mediation. And-
Mediation is built in with this form.
Yes. Yes.
And it's mandated. And then is there a possibility a buyer can refuse to sign arbitration?
Yes, yeah, that is, in the contract, there's signature lines or initial lines for the buyer to say they want arbitration or not. And it's okay for the buyer not to have arbitration, elect not to go through arbitration, but the seller has to be in agreement. You have to have a meeting of the minds. So you have to have an agreement not to have arbitration, or you have to have an agreement to have arbitration. If you don't
Okay.
have an agreement on that, you might as well be off $100,000 on the purchase price. It's the same thing. You don't have a meeting of the minds. Same thing with liquidated damages. So where those initials are, both parties have to agree to either have it or not have it. Now, I'm going to go one step further, making this a little more complicated. Now, if there's a count, now say a buyer signs liquidated damages. Okay. And the seller does not sign liquidated damages. Okay, we don't have a meeting of the minds, right?
Right. What
happens if the seller, now a lot of times the sellers doesn't sign liquidated damages because they forget it. They overlook the initial. And they counter offer. Maybe they don't like the price, so they counter offer the price by $50,000 on the pre-printed form for counter offer. Number one. Now I'm going to tell you, if you, for your homework assignment, pull up the counter offer form. In the pre-printed form above where you fill in the counter offer terms, there is a paragraph that says, if there is a paragraph in the purchase agreement where one party initials and the other party doesn't, and the counteroffer is accepted, this is deemed to have, we have a signed acceptance, but that paragraph is not in effect. And you'll be able to appreciate this probably once you have the counteroffer form in front of you. So what I'm saying is, in the contract, when I review contracts and I'm looking at the liquidated damage form, and I see that one party has initial and the other party doesn't, the first thing I say is, oh no, we don't have a valid contract. Then I look through when I get to the end and I see that there's a counteroffer. I go, thank God, because the counteroffer says that we have a valid contract because the counteroffer has been signed and agreed upon. But then my next thought is, oh no, the person that did not sign liquidated damages, or the person that signed liquidated damages, I wonder if they realize that they don't have liquidated damages. Did you get what I'm going through on this? So one party, say the buyer signs liquidated damages. The seller does not sign liquidated damages, but counters the purchase agreement. And the purchase agreement is accepted. That buyer signing the purchase agreement and the counteroffer, now we have a valid contract, even though supposedly only one person initial liquidated damages. But the counteroffer says that if one party signs and one party doesn't, we still have a valid contract
Okay,
because the counteroffer was used.
okay,
And so let me give you that scenario I gave you a half an hour ago about a $2 million sale. The buyer breaching a contract, seller resells it at 1.5. The buyer with liquidated damages was only at risk $60,000 for the breach. Now that he breached and the seller has lost $500,000, no liquidated damages, now the buyer's at risk at 500,000, not 60. So you see how important liquidated damages is.
okay,
Same thing applies that's why we have to look to make sure that if our buyer signed liquidated damages, that the seller signed liquidated damages.
got it.
And if there's no counteroffer, we don't have a deal. That's probably worse. But if there is a counteroffer, then we have a deal, but there's no liquidated damages.
Okay,
All right, you guys gotta know that. Just we can't get into assuming things so much. That's why it's important to look at the whole contract when you get it back.
okay,
Okay?
okay,
Any
thank you.
guys? I got nothing else to say. I wish you a great weekend. Stay safe on these roads. And don't go to Santa Cruz.
We're here. Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Have a
Thank
good
Thank you,
you.
Mike. It's very helpful.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right,
Thank
take
you.
care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Welcome.